Hello, everybody. And my name is Dana Howard. I'm a member of the Center for Bioethics and the Philosophy Department at Ohio State University. Welcome to the Center for Ethics and Human Values Monthly Care panel. The Conversations about Research Ethics Care is a program that aims to support Ohio State's shared values in the domain of research by building a community around discussions of research integrity. The CARE program is presented in support with the OSUMC Center for Bioethics and the Clinical and Translational Science Institute. And as a member of the Center for Ethics and Human Values, we are so happy to have you here today with us. Today, we're doing a special collaboration with the Mershon Center to present a panel on the ethics of conducting research in the context of war and other conflicts. And the ethical complexities of conducting research in conflict zones raise really important ethical considerations about researcher responsibilities, participant protections, and how to think about research when also there's a crisis and there might be other kinds of humanitarian needs. So I want to thank our four panelists for joining us today and bringing each of your distinctive perspectives, a wealth of practical experience. It's very exciting to have all four of you here and a variety of disciplinary backgrounds on this issue. So let me introduce our four panelists and then say a little bit about how the next hour and 15 minutes is going to go. So we have as our external outside panelist who's going to start off the conversation is Dr. Hannah Wild in the Department of Surgery at University of Washington. Dr. Wild's research is focused on humanitarian response for civilian casualties in conflict settings, and her clinical interests are in trauma surgery and critical care. She's conducted extensive field work with conflict-affected nomadic populations on the Ethiopia-South Sudan border, and is a member of the Explosive Weapons Trauma Care Collective. Dr. Wild will start the conversation about your own experiences, the way you've been thinking about the main ethical challenges of your work. And then we'll turn it to our Ohio State University experts. Joining us today is Donal Omothuna, who is a professor in College of Nursing. Dr. Omothuna's research focuses on disasters, pandemics, and humanitarian crises, in particular examining ethical issues in One Health research. We also have Dr. Erin Lin, who's an associate professor in political science at Ohio State. Dr. Lin's research focuses on the legacies of war, economic development, agriculture, and genocide. And she has a new book that's just hot off the presses from University Princeton Press entitled When the Bombs Stopped, The Legacy of War in Rural Cambodia, which documents how undetonated bombs from the Vietnam War still affect Cambodian farmers and their land till this day. And finally, we have Dr. Terry Murphy, who is Associate Director for Peacebuilding Research at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies. She has been actively engaged in conflict intervention and peacebuilding, as well as research in several international contexts for the past 30 years, including Colombia, Northern Ireland, the Basque Country, Nepal, Burundi, and Turkey, Syria. So once we introduce each perspectives, you could share your own experiences and the way you've been thinking about these issues. We'll jump into a structured conversation with some preset questions, and then it's your turn, audience, to ask questions as well. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A function. Please put those questions and we'll have a lot of time at the end, the last about 25, 30 minutes for Q&A from the audience. All right, so to no further ado, we'll have Hannah, you can start us off.
Thank you so much. And Lane, if you have a chance to share my slides, I would appreciate it. I currently live and work in Burkina Faso, and due to some circumstances out of my control, neither my internet or my sort of peace and quiet of a place to present are that good. So someone flag to me if it becomes disruptive. Thank you for the opportunity to present and work with this panel on the important subject of research ethics in the context of war. I lead an initiative called the Explosive Weapons Trauma Care Collective, which is founded to improve coordination between health and protection actors to improve care for victims of explosive injury. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide. For me, I see my role in this panel as bringing questions. I do not have answers, and I wouldn't even venture to propose any except in direct collaboration with my local partners here. I work directly with local surgeons and local doctors, and they're the ones who have the expertise and contextual knowledge that is absolutely necessary to answer anything that I might ask. So thank you for the opportunity to ask my questions. And I wanted to flip the talk in terms of the ethical problems and why to conduct research in ethics settings, period. This is why. This is a little boy that I am now close with. His photograph is used with permission from his mother and his family, because there's a sickening proportion of preventable death and disability among civilians in complex settings, but we lack the data necessary to advocate on both sides, both advocating for services, targeting programming for improved trauma care, but also preemptively banning weapons that cause injuries. Next slide, please. So 2 casualty curves that illustrate this in a military population, and these are data from the US-led war in Afghanistan. Even though injury severity, as depicted on the top line, increased from 2005 to 2013, case fatality rate decreased by about 50%, from 16 to 8%, due to a series of coordinated trauma care advances. Next slide. In contrast, these are data from the Landmine Cluster Munition Monitor showing that not only is the civilian fatality rate among victims of explosive ordnance 40%, but it hasn't decreased in decades. Next slide, please. These are some of the advances that were targeted to bring about those decreases in preventable death in a military population. And even though many of the resources available in that environment aren't available in the context of civilian casualties and low resource settings, some of these interventions could be adapted and translated, but there has not been a coordinated effort to do this systematically. Next slide, please. There are a number of reasons for this. One, no helicopter or fixed wing exists for evacuation. Patients are evacuated using whatever means exist, so slung over the shoulder of bystanders and donkey ambulances, as a result of which, in our context, over 25%, less than 25%, even of military casualties, reach care in less than 6 hours. One hospital in Kabul, less than 6% of patients reach the hospital within the so-called golden hour, meaning the most important period after injury to reach care. Next slide, please. One of the other issues that we face is that you aren't treating a population of young, healthy men wearing body armor, but women, pregnant women, children, the elderly, people with pre-existing disabilities and medical conditions who do not have any of that protection. Next slide, please. There are all kinds of things that could be done to improve this situation, and we're talking about only a couple today, and only a couple as they intersect with my current work. But by way of explaining why I'm here in Burkina Faso, unfortunately, this is a region that has been affected increasingly by the conflict in the Sahel, terrorism, which is the locally accepted term for violent extremism. And very little of these advances have made it to our context here. So as one example of what we're trying to do, so the military's tactical combat casualty care is their term for basically bystander first aid, whereby life-saving care, heavy focus on tourniquet application in that environment, is brought closer to the point of injury by training not only medical personnel, but all military service members in first aid measures, essentially. Next slide, please. So here we're partnering with the World Health Organization, Mines Advisory Group, which is a demining organization, and very importantly, our local partners, Pull for Progress, and a whole range of local doctors here, to reach communities affected by the threat of IEDs with IED risk education, which is already widely done by mine action stakeholders, but we are integrating layperson first responder training to try and improve care and increase community capacity to respond to injury in these environments where evacuation times are so long. Next slide, please. All of that is just scene setting, but more ethical challenges than I ever anticipated arose or arise every day. And, you know, I appreciate our IRB board, they're thorough, but it's almost as if they address technical issues without some of these deeper things that really bother me. So, and that I ask my team all the time, where can participants even gather that is okay for a long period of time in a complex setting? How long is too long? What am I putting them at risk for by even being present in the community if somebody is, training youth. So one issue that happened when we started doing a needs analysis was that, you know, I had originally planned on only training individuals over the age of 18, but that was completely unacceptable from a sociocultural standpoint, because sometimes young adults are household leaders. Meanwhile, is it okay to train minors in something that might put them at risk of moral injury or make them feel like they have a skill set that they're obliged to use, even in a situation where they're scared or overwhelmed? And what does real assent look like in that situation? And then, of course, a major and incredibly concrete one is the safety of trainees if they respond to try and care for somebody who has been injured in an IED incident. Next slide, please. I'm just going to share this one last anecdote and then move on, because I'm actually extremely keen to hear the responses and thoughts of other panelists. And forgive me, I've tried to redact anything that's particularly upsetting in these slides, but I think this is such an important example about context appropriate adaptation and the need to partner directly with local trauma care providers. So I think one question that was raised is something like, or you know, when people challenge the importance of research at all. So we're doing a massive contextual analysis here to understand what is appropriate in the environment. But an example of real harm that arose from that not being done. So tourniquet guidance from high resource settings has been widely applied to low resource settings. And so a tactical tourniquet in the high resource military means basically, you may have heard the adage high and tight, meaning if you're under active fire and don't have time to figure out exactly what's bleeding, you place a tourniquet as high up as possible on the affected extremity, which is not a problem when you have a helicopter for evacuation and reach a facility in 30 minutes or less than an hour. Well, it's a huge problem in my environment, our environment, this environment, where, as I've just told you, less than a quarter of patients even reach a facility in 6 hours, and irreversible tissue damage occurs at 2 hours. So when the training that was imported essentially from high resource settings is applied here, and you can advance, please. I actually don't know if the animation will even work in this. Yeah, it does. This is what happens, right? So these injuries either didn't need a tourniquet or needed one much lower than it was applied. And these patients have had hip dysarticulation and shoulder dysarticulation and lost limbs in a setting where that is devastating functionally, because you have no access to, or very challenging and limited access to prosthetics. And that was unnecessary. Next slide, please. I'm going to probably just skip to the end because I want to hear from panelists. But another thing is, you know, when the IRB wants you to put in something like, we'll refer to, you know, provide whatever psychosocial resources, well, they don't exist. So what? They don't exist, you know, and maybe someone else needs to take on that research so we can advocate for it. So next slide, which is probably just in conclusion, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have everyone's expertise to discuss these important issues.
Thank you so much for setting the stage and bringing up some of these really compelling and examples. Why don't we start with, we'll go in order of with Donal Omotuna next. Just introduce yourself, your work, and sort of for 5 minutes, the way in which you've been thinking about some of these issues.
Yeah, thank you, Dana and Hannah and everybody else. My name is Donal Omotuna. My background is originally in pharmacy, but for most of my career, I've been focused on healthcare ethics. And since the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, more and more of my focus has been on ethical issues that come up regarding healthcare and related research. with disasters, humanitarian crises, and most recently with conflict as well. So my my the area that I focus in on is I'd say around one of the last points that Hannah was making there about what can often be a disconnect between the research ethics, systems and procedures and what's going on the ground. And I think coming, from a healthcare background, and having been involved in evidence-based practice for many years as well, the importance of research and evidence gathering is, it's so significant. And I think sometimes, it has happened that, disaster settings, humanitarian settings, and now conflict settings have been seen as just such difficult environments that why would anybody want to be carrying out research in those settings? And there's I think there's an ethos of concern and focus on safety for everybody involved that is very appropriate. But you also then have this kind of other side of the equation where things are being done, and then in all settings something is being done, and we either have evidence to support it or we don't, or we're doing things where we also need to find out, well, does it work or does it not? And so research is really important to be carrying out in these really difficult settings. And so then the question becomes, well, then how is it done most ethically? How can it be done most safely? And through, I think, for a number of unintended reasons, I think IRB systems have developed to be very focused on the procedures, the applications, informed consent, which I think are all very appropriate. They're all very important. But what's I think gotten less attention then is, so what then helps the researcher on the ground who maybe has all these ethical approvals but faces something in the field? Where do they go? If they go into the system again, sometimes the first reaction is, well, then we got to stop everything and examine it for a couple of months and then come back, or or if you're lucky, a few weeks. So what I've been looking at is, how can we have a system where the concerns that the healthcare regulatory agencies and the committees and the procedures are maintained, but also look at ways to appropriately balance these practical concerns. And I think we're sort of at a starting point where we need to first just even gather the stories of people to find out, what are researchers like Hannah facing in the field? What do they think would help them, either from past experiences or from something that they would love to be able to do this project? How could an ethics oversight system be the type of system that helps to promote the most safe, the most high quality, and the most practical types of research that would go on, and then also provide the support as the projects get rolled out, where questions are inevitably going to be raised, things are not going to go as you planned, but how can they get real-time assistance to continue to maneuver through the setting and do high quality work? So that, in a nutshell, is what I'm trying to do through some different projects I'm involved with.
Thank you, Donal. Erin, do you want to go next?
Oh, I'd love to. I have a couple of points that echo exactly things that Hannah had mentioned. And topically, I study unexploded ordnance, but on a different kind of side of what goes on in a different part of the world. And so the two things that I want to echo when we address this question of, like, what are the ethical obligations of researchers who study conflict areas, but particularly like researchers from the US or from areas from the global north. the way I want to talk about it is kind of generated in some of the arguments that I make in my research in my book. And it's a book that talks about the unintended consequences of US foreign policy in this particular snapshot of history during the Vietnam War. And I find that like unexploded ordnance tends to cluster in the most fertile areas of Cambodia because they go off when they hit sufficient impact on ground conditions and hard ground conditions. And so you have actually like the most fertile areas experience the most bomb failure, and then you see the most unexploded ordnance in those areas today. And the effect of that is that it essentially is removing the fertility advantage of high fertility land. So those areas are producing at rates of the lowest fertility land in Cambodia because they're so dangerous to access. And essentially create this sphere of fear where, you know, rumors of one unexploded bomb being found that day will basically impact the farming behavior of people in that community. So it's kind of larger. The effect is larger than the initial blast radius. And I think what's particularly scary about that is a couple of things. Like first, like these kind of short-term adjustments in individual farming practices accumulate over time. So over 50, 60 years, you see long-term underdevelopment of these farming areas, as well as long-term household poverty. And then the other scary thing is that like these effects actually can't easily be reversed. And so there's part of us that I think wants to kind of believe in, I don't want to say easy fixes because humanitarian demining is not easy at all. It's a painstaking process that requires a lot of intensive capital equipment. But even when you remove those undetonated bombs, there are still these kind of secondary impacts upon that, where in the case of Cambodia, you essentially are putting farmers now at risk of getting their land stolen because they're living in a highly kleptocratic environment where the economic elite are kind of just waiting for the right opportunity to take land that will basically be very useful investments for them for commercial agriculture. And so the reason why I kind of bring all of this detail up is that I think it really makes you think like, what is the lesson here? Like it's important to ruminate about like what this means in terms of our obligations as American citizens. And really think about the fact, like the really uncomfortable fact that like the costs of our human security abroad and like in our own isolated spaces, like the actions that our nation takes in pursuit of our global national security, they all have unforeseen consequences. And in this case, they've taken away the liberty of Cambodian farmers. And my answer, like, I don't know if it's immediately satisfying, but it's really the fact that I think the US political community should do more to connect with like the experience of the victims of American military violence, because I think only by informing ourselves, caring about others, and really being curious about like the world outside of ourselves can we really start to feel the true weight of our military actions. And I think the degree of like localized knowledge and nuance that needs to take place in order to start making amends for those things. And it's a kind of just like a different approach that than you see in like traditional political science accounts and international relations, where like our main outcomes of interest are like global balance of power and military outcomes. Instead, I'm trying to like push more towards you know, this subset of scholars that study the human costs of war, not necessarily always in a quantitative context, even though I totally understand, but like also in a heavy immersive fieldwork context where you really try to vividly describe the effects of like bombing from the perspective of the victim. Because going back to one of Hannah's points, it is like really, really hard to get people to want to pay attention to these issues because they're very sad and because they feel very remote. And when I think more about like where the burden of responsibility lies, it's actually really hard to necessarily think like, oh, well, this is a problem that like the military, say, should be like addressing and researching, or the humanitarian world, or even like a government problem. I think the problem with all of this is like when you think about a lot of these agencies, they're like very, or institutions, they're very program driven, right? So like the military is operations driven. Like they have like one concrete goal and they essentially have to do whatever it takes within bounds to accomplish that goal. So they're not set up to do nuanced, highly immersive, time intensive and resource intensive research on this, especially given the fact that like the things that I think are worth studying are these secondary consequences of war. which means that like we don't actually have like clear through lines in terms of like this military event happens and then this leads to like poverty 60 years later. And so the people who are kind of best equipped to answer those types of questions are academically trained researchers who have an array of methods, who have the time to invest in developing those methodological skills, as well as the time to invest in like developing a lot of local knowledge of the areas that they work. So in the end, this is really this like clarion call to probably like the graduate students who are like listening on this panel, where it's kind of like, I think there is this dire need for these types of like brilliant young minds who are just eager to pursue any types of different research questions. I think this space is actually normatively perfect to enter because there is such I think, ethical need to create the data sets, do the well-tested studies, and eventually just write the research up in a way that can be easy enough to read so a large audience will actually receive the message, because there's just very few people who can kind of do all of those things. So that's my 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. And Terry, you could close out the introductions.
Okay. Thanks so much, Dana, for inviting Rashawn to co-sponsor and participate in this panel discussion. Many of our center's affiliates, including Dr. Lin, work in, on, and around war. So there's much expertise to draw upon. So humbly, I'm just one voice among many. My remarks will focus a little bit more on the social science research side of this conversation, and like Aaron, the human costs of war. But I think there are clear overlaps with biomedical research ethics as well. So throughout my career, I have circled between the actual practice of building peace, conducting different kinds of research in spaces of conflict, and I also contribute to peace-related policy development with governments, donors, and NGOs. So for me, it is important and also ethical that each aspect of these peace-related efforts are in constant conversation with each other. And at this point, all three of these domains are wonderfully fused for me, and I'm working inside a few different research to practice collaborative teams. So what constitutes peace, war, fragility, insecurity, security? They're defined and described differently in these various institutional settings. And so it's common for me to hear the language of inter and intrastate war, civil war, but also armed conflict, internal conflict, complex emergency settings, political violence, ethnic conflict, latent conflict, even troubled peace. And then in my work, the dynamics range from extreme volatility to spaces that are more marked by routine or cyclical expressions of violence, or where there are pockets of violence. They may also be shaped by repressive authoritarian regimes, areas controlled by armed groups, widespread corruption, and organized crime. And there's a spectrum of violences in which the intensity of conflict is varied, different stages in the life cycles or timeline of a conflict, where the scope and the severity of impact of violence, it could be widespread, or the locations are intimate and acutely specific. I've worked with victims, combatants, perpetrators, and some are all three, with competing perspectives and interests. And always, gender-based and sexual violence is rampant. So in these contexts, there has been or is terror, there's fear, there's human rights violations, there's crimes against humanities, there's mass displacement. And that means there is suspicion, paranoia, desperation, anger, fury, human insecurity, uncertainty. There's mental and physical health distress. This is, there is immense emotional and physical vulnerability, dependency, and therefore the risk of unwitting exploitation as a researcher, I think, is quite high. Beyond the academic IRB process and the ethics of conducting research with human subjects, outside of ensuring validity, reliability, generalizability, or concerns related to data security, data storage, etc., there are several other ethical considerations that have come to shape what it means for me to be an ethical researcher and the processes that I use in conducting research. So as a starting point, I think very deeply and ethically about power, my positionality and my identities. It remains at the forefront of my consciousness, my privilege, my ability to move in and out of spaces of violence. I can leave. My blue passport, being from the North and the West, what this means, what doors this opens and closes, what I'm able to access that I wouldn't be able to access here in the United States, how I might raise expectations, how I might be targeted, manipulated, or become co-opted into larger political agendas that I'm not even aware of. So there's almost never not an ethical conundrum to face. So I want to just quickly highlight 3 sensitivities that I believe have helped me anticipate and mitigate the negative consequences of my own presence and research in the field. I won't go into detail, but if there's interest, we can speak about it further in the Q&A. And these terms are used in the triple nexus of humanitarian development and peace building efforts. And while they're not necessarily named in the same way, they're also found within the range of academic fields and disciplines. And the first one is conflict sensitivity. And that goes beyond just simply doing no harm or the do no harm principles. And that is my ability to understand the context in which I'm researching and conducting, and I always begin with conducting an extensive conflict and context analysis, looking at the causes, the drivers of spatiality, the tensions, the triggers. For me, this is an imperative before I step foot any place that I go. Second one is trauma sensitivity, and I'm speaking more about psychological trauma, although medical trauma or physical trauma is also part of it. And when you're working with human subjects, understanding the impact of traumatic experience, multiple traumatic experiences and events and trauma exposure. Also the cultural expressions of trauma and how they show up differently in the different spaces that I work. And then gender sensitivity. It's very important to acknowledge the different needs and experience and roles of individuals based on their gender, recognizing that men, women, boys, girls, and non-binary individuals face distinctive challenges during crisis, but also that within these groups, there is distinctiveness and power differentials as well. So these are just additional sensitivities that I offer into our conversation. For me, they serve as kind of almost like a trifocal lens on a pair of ethical glasses that when I peer through them, that help me to see and to be differently in contexts of conflict and violence. Thanks.
Thank you all. One thing that I'm struck by is the sort of ways in which Hannah and Aaron are both researching, like the cause of the research is the same, but the sort of time frame is like so different in terms of what moments we're researching and how we sort of consider that sort of a research related to a conflict setting. So maybe one question to start off the conversation is, in some ways, the most fundamental, like primary question is, how do we or can we even draw boundaries around what counts as a conflict or a war setting for research purposes? Maybe Aaron, we'll start with you, and then anyone else who wants to join in can answer that.
Sure. I remember having this conversation with Terry a month ago or so too. I I definitely argue in the book that even though Cambodia is considered a post-conflict setting now, it has just a very eerie feeling to it in the places where I conduct research because there's just the threat of explosion in a lot of the surrounding rice paddies. So it doesn't necessarily feel like a country at peace, even though it technically is one. Um, and uh, and I think I kind of just live in a world in which, I let the IR scholars who want to study like war termination and like peace settlements and like, they can have their own thing. And then I'll just make a separate point thereafter where I think the lived experience in a post-conflict area can vary across regions and even within a country. And this is just like one set of individualized experiences that I just wanted to document at least in the written record so that we know that there's still some ironies to that idea. Yeah, I definitely think the threat of conflict still exists in these areas where there are active mines and unexploded ordnance.
Would anyone else like to sort of bring in the way in which they've been thinking about whether or not there are boundaries to conflict or how to think about that for research purposes?
I can pop in here really quickly. Just last week I was in Colombia. And maybe people are aware, but in 2016, they signed a comprehensive agreement with the FARC. And Bogota, which is where I was behaving like any major city behaves. And but where we are conducting research out in Huila, the researchers felt extremely threatened by FARC dissidents. And there are 8 different conflicts occurring in Colombia right now. So even if there's peace with FARC, and even if there's relative peace in Bogota, there's not peace with other groups. So I think simultaneously you can have relative peace in one area, in the one area of the country, but you can have civil war or pockets of civil war in other areas of the country. So for me, the boundaries are very blurred in this respect as well.
I guess maybe I'd just add from, just my personal background. I grew up in Ireland, beside the border on the Republic side. So I didn't have any real direct impact from the troubles, as we call them, when they were going on there in the, 60s, 70s, 80s. And the peace treaty was signed in 1998. And so there's normality in most ways, but there are still parts of Northern Ireland you go into, and within seconds, this is a place where things could erupt if there's a spark. So I would think that it's less about having a clear understanding of what we mean by it or what term we use for it, but maybe more about Terry's sensitivities, that when you go into a certain area, or if there's certain topics that you're going to talk about, that you need to have extra sensitivity than if you're going into a different part of the same country and talking about a different issue. So I think it's that where I think it really comes down to the researchers understanding all of those contexts that Terry talked about and many others, so that they are sensitive to the local setting and issues.
So maybe I'll jump into the next question, which is about the distinctiveness of conducting research in these settings. And Terry, you brought up these sort of 3 sensitivities. Hannah and Aaron, you've already brought up some distinctive ethical challenges that come from working in the field. I just want to invite you to, I think that the details are just like so important here. I'm just learning so much from hearing these stories. And so I want to invite each of you to tell us a little bit more about how research in these settings is different from other kinds of research in the fields, and what you feel is distinctive in the ethical challenges that arise, and whether or not you think that there are some distinctive priorities of engaging in research in these conflict settings. Maybe we'll start with Hannah, and then we can go on from there.
Thank you. I think there is, while it's obviously incredibly important to avoid re-traumatization and some of the longer term sequelae that come from interviewing survivors of conflict or violence, there's something categorically more concrete about working somewhere where you're actually maybe putting them at an actual danger, again, through your presence in a community, through the skills you're giving them without adequate protections, through the way you're going about it. So for me, it's I couldn't agree more with what Donnell said. I have immense appreciation for our IRB board, especially some of the more substantive conversations they've had with me, but in general, and I'm not speaking about my current institution necessarily, but in general, I do think that people like myself who have a lot of expertise in their content area, but not in the ethical implications of that work, really lack a place to ask those questions beyond, like you said, the more procedural considerations. And when the consequences are so concrete and final, that really, from the bottom of my heart, it weighs on me.
Thank you, Hannah. Does anyone else want to share sort of any priorities for research or what you take to be sort of distinctive ethical challenges? Yeah,
Yeah,
Anne.
I can go next. Um, so I conduct research in Cambodia, which I think most people probably know in terms of the Khmer Rouge. So it's a heavily traumatized society, where one generation that was, that survived the 1970s has a distinct political memory of the consequences of speaking, and honestly just speaking out loud sometimes, not even just trying to say anything that was oppositional. I think like the way, and this might actually address Barbara's question too, that's in the Q&A about like interview fatigue. But like, I mean, it's tricky, right? And I think the pet peeve that I've tried to address in my research is also how I kind of conduct my fieldwork, which is like trying to understand people more wholly and like beyond the traumas that I think might have drawn us to the research question, the research site. I think it kind of plays up against like the narratives that I usually see in like, say, documentary films, where like someone is essentially just defined by their trauma. And they don't have lives outside of that. And I found like when I was first doing interviews, like, right, like no one, no, like if you prompt people with those questions, like you're just going to get these very concrete narratives that tend to be, to me, like very oriented towards outsiders. But I think if you just start like asking questions more oriented towards like people's nuanced personalities and their other types of interests, and like just try to kind of get to know them in a deeply invested way rather than just like this clear, I think, I'm just going to talk to you for an hour and leave and never see you again. I find that like the interview quality just like increases dramatically. So like when I was conducting research for my book, I was actively going out and farming with my respondents. And part of this was because that was like my hobby at the time. Like in graduate school, I would just work on a farm for my off hours. And so that was like the one skill that I had to like offer as like free labor. But I also was just like genuinely interested in like how their soils were different. I was conducting heavy metal toxicity tests for them to let them like understand or know if the unexploded ordnance were leaching toxic materials or like large amounts of heavy metals into their soils. And so it was like it just felt much more like, okay, like this woman is actually helping me in some regards, and like actually trying to learn from me. And then the stories would kind of get woven in about like their memories of bombing. Because it was clear to them like it wasn't part of my agenda. And so it's like the tricky part, right, is that you still have to weave in like your IRB, like oral protocol procedures in terms of like getting the oral consents and everything. But like just taking the time to get to know your respondents, I think makes the field work so much interesting. And I actually think of interview fatigue in two directions, right? I think it's like exhausting to be peppered with like an array of questions from a stranger, especially if those questions are not very specific to those person's individualized circumstances. Like what is the likelihood that they actually want to open up to you about them? And like to me, like sometimes sometimes I don't even like it's like mildly offensive, right? Where it just feels like you get paired, like you just get asked the same set of questions that like everyone else gets asked, even though like technically your IRB constrains you to some extent. But the more I was like able to demonstrate just like pure curiosity about like what weird minutia, like what Cambodian plants are called, and like how certain tools work and how you sharpen them. And like then it just led to all of these other stories that were embedded within my research guide. So in some ways to me, like it requires a lot of creativity as a researcher, because what you're trying to talk about topically is just like tough. And to be honest, like the areas that we have access to tend to be over interviewed. And so like people kind of have a sense of like what international people want to hear. Um, and so it's almost like you have to catch, I don't want to say like people off guard. Like in some ways you just have to be like genuine and yourself, and show true, I think, investment in them as a person in the area. And I don't know, I feel like that it operates the same way here too. I'd be like, yeah, the ways I make friends here is the same way I try to find respondents in conflict settings.
So thank you, Erin. And I just want to, for the audience, especially because this is being recorded so that people know what this question is, because I think it's a fabulous question. So Barbara Roth asked, I was wondering if you could speak to interview fatigue and the ethics of this. It seems like conflict and post-conflict settings that are ethically and practically, quote unquote, easier to research is often end up bearing a heavy burden for participating in research that may not end up benefiting them directly very much. And so, I mean, there is one thing that I'm hearing is both like access, like who you have access to, and thinking not only about sort of like scientific validity of the research and representation, but like also the potential burdens that those participants have to face. And so thank you, Erin, for sharing some of your strategies that you use in order to really hear the full stories and sort of mediate against those issues. And I'm wondering if anyone else wants to talk about sort of interview fatigue or this concerns related to researchers coming into this, like being outsiders coming in, and sort of some of the ethical concerns that come up with that power dynamic. As Terry said, you could always leave, but also you're also often the one coming in.
I'm happy to go, just to say a couple things. I think some of the challenges that I have faced, especially in really repressed settings, is the one would be my perceived alignment with a local NGO. I typically work with NGOs in those settings, but my presence impacts them. And they have a fear that the government is going to shut their door. So like I can't even say human rights in some contexts. So I have to be mindful that when I come into a context to do research, there are, in terms of conflict sensitivity, I can impact the institutional partners that I'm working with, and it can have significant implications for their future, for example. I also, I come with kind of a more ethnographic sensibility to the way I do my work. So I don't like to parachute in. In fact, I kind of move away from those types of projects. I want to be able to go for repeated periods of time so that I can build relationships. But quite frankly, in some war settings in particular, that's just a luxury. And the kind of evidence that people are looking for and need are like counting and mapping. Where are people going? How many beds do we need? Are there water wells? I mean, it's a different kind of research that takes place on the spectrum of violence. And so we have to think about the timing in the conflict itself. Is it appropriate or not appropriate? What my research questions are. How long can I be there? How useful is it? Am I able to develop meaningful relationships? And maybe, and sometimes you just can't. But then we have to think about extractive behaviors, which I think academics can really get in trouble with. Very extractive kind of research. So for me, when I go in and out, and I try to have an ethnographic sensibility, it complicates my impartiality. It becomes complicated for me when I'm with desperate people. And no matter how clear I am, and I try to be clear with them, there is a raised expectation that they're going to get some benefit from me, no matter how much I try to explain it. And they're going to request money. They're going to request clothing for their children. They're going to seek assistance for visas. They're going to expect that if they share their story with me, that there's going to be some benefit to their lives. And I really struggle with failing to really deliver local benefits. I can see the benefits maybe to the academic community, but what about the ethics of delivering to those local communities themselves? So that kind of that complicated impartiality shows up for me and raises questions. So I just add those couple things that are challenging for me.
Well, maybe I'll kind of say something as well. And it ties in with Jerry's comment in the Q&A as well about kind of US-based IRBs versus local ones. But I think part of what we have to do is to I guess take the long-term perspective as well as the crisis situation. But as you know, Dana and I are involved in a program where a number of us at Ohio State are working with people at the University of Nairobi in Kenya, and it's a long-term training program for researchers who will ultimately be able to contribute to their local ethics committees. And I think it's that sort of way of not just hoping that we can get to do our research in these other settings and other countries, but then how do we actually build capacity there so that they can tell the outside researchers, no, that's not going to work here, or that's not appropriate in our context. And so I think that's a very important element, the whole, I guess, ethical obligation of capacity building. And it can be really, satisfying. We had one of our trainees told me in class last week that he's just learned that things that were just normal practice for him in his local setting were just not ethical because he'd never really been exposed to some of this training. And so it's really encouraging to see that people who are researching locally, really want that sort of capacity building, training. And so we need to do that in addition to the projects. And just, again, as Terry was saying, what's the local benefit, not just what are the publications we get out of it as overseas researchers, or even just our satisfaction. It's got to come back to the local benefit.
So let me jump in and ask this question about local benefits. And one thing that I'm hearing is there's this tension between the sort of quote unquote partiality of the researcher and this sort of very standard view of research where it's like the difference between research and clinical practice is that research is not for the benefit of the participant, whereas clinical practice is for the benefit of the patient, right? And if people don't understand that, then there's something going wrong with the whole research enterprise. There's therapeutic misconception, right? And I'm hearing that there's just a built-in tension in this setting between the standard view and the experiences and the ethical challenges that researchers are feeling on the ground. And so one question that I have, and this is going to be the last question sort of from the preset questions. We've already jumped into some of the Q&A from the guests. Thank you so much for asking awesome questions. So it's just, how should we think about the duties of sort of ancillary care, providing humanitarian services, actually thinking about research participation as more transactional? So it's like, should we be thinking a little bit more about the benefits for participants and maybe the community? And how should we navigate that related to our responsibilities as researchers? So maybe we'll have Hannah go first, and then we could open it up.
Thanks. If I'm understanding correctly, though the way you create, the way you established or painted a dichotomy between research and clinical practice activities, I guess maybe I'm lucky because as a surgeon, they're fairly concrete, and so any research I'm undertaking is done to inform them, so they're not separate for me. Like we, created an entire toolkit to have communities engaged in our layperson first responder trainings to understand what locally available materials are appropriate, what is appropriate in their context, what appropriate and safe to answer some of the, honestly, I didn't plan to do this work, but it was the way I devised of answering some of these questions about what was safe and acceptable to them, and both, and also religious and sociocultural considerations around involvement of men and women. And I have to tell you, I wish I had found a way. I wasn't here when you invited me, and I really wish I had found a way to co-present with one of my local partners, because that's the only thing that's honestly right. But I'm doing my best to represent some of our questions. And so anyway, another example is the tourniquet issue I told you about. I'm working with our military surgeons here to create a training to address that. And the research that we're doing is is really solely focused around making sure that we're moving in the right direction. So I think I have the benefit of the research being kind of hand in hand with clinical activities, and I don't think I would feel okay about it if it weren't.
Erin or Terry, do you want to speak to a potential tension? I mean, maybe it is the difference between like doing clinical research in emergency settings versus doing some of this more like sort of interview research where there might not be a prospect of benefit for the participants except for, you know, allowing them to tell their story.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of, I guess I try to tamp down any expectations, right? That like this exchange of information is going to do anything to improve their life. And like, I think part of this is just like knowing the research process and how few people ultimately read my research, to like know if it'll have any type of downstream effect. But I think it's also, I mean, like the way I like to understand it is that like to me it puts a heavy burden, like a huge responsibility on my shoulders to make the research as good as possible, both like methodologically, but then also in terms of the quality of the written word, like to make it as accessible and as like interesting to read and as applicable to as many of the right pieces of research across an array of disciplines, so that like more and more people are just aware of these issues. Because I feel like, you know, as an academic, one of the things you have to develop is like know your sweet spot, like know what your comparative advantage is, and like know what is this potential audience that will actually listen to you and is interested in this type of research, and like then try to write powerfully to them, so that they start really engaging and caring about that issue. But even if like that is the best case scenario, I still know that's not going to like say drastically increase the amount of humanitarian demining in Cambodia, or even if that is like the best solution. So I feel like I mean, it's like couples therapy. It's like open communication is like the best. And I think just explaining a little bit about like, not the power structures you have in academia, but just like how little we might matter. So that way they kind of can understand what like, not just like what is going to happen after the interview in terms of like, you know, where you're going to archive the data and how password protected it's going to be, but also just like, even when this gets written up, like it's not going to be like a Dan Brown bestseller book that everyone's going to care about. It's just going to be a smaller audience.
Maybe another question, and we could continue talking about some of these issues, but one question that came up from Catherine Hetchmer in the audience is a question concerning exploitation that I think is really interesting, and it touches upon something that Donal was saying about like who's benefiting from the research and why are we doing this research in the first place, and putting things on our CVs. So Catherine asks, so she's registered for this because she supervises social work students in a student-run free clinic setting, and in Ohio, in Columbus, and the bulk of the patients, so I'm just going to read in Catherine's voice, the bulk of our patients are immigrants, whether or not documented, large Somali, Nepali, Bhutanese populations in Columbus. So they're post-conflict zone, but still traumatized. The students are very interested in conducting research in the clinic, and I'm very interested in protecting our patients from exploitation as a captive audience with incentive to say yes to participate. And then students use this research for resumes, for residency, for med school applications, though I think their heart is in the right place. And so one question that I have is the concern about exploitation. And I mean, another way of asking this question most broadly is, are participants in these settings, both in conflict but also post-conflict, are they a vulnerable population? Are they particularly vulnerable to exploitation? If so, yes. And I mean, if so, like, how should we as researchers and maybe have sort of systems in place to mitigate against the possible exploitation? So those are sort of questions that I think really come up from Catherine's comment. And maybe I'll let Donal start the conversation since you brought up these issues in the first place. And then if anyone else wants to chime in.
Um, yeah, I think there's a lot of different things involved there. And I think, there's, I think there has to be a realization that this could be exploitative, that there's always that risk when the power dynamics are involved. And I think you've got the population has just described that, probably there's a variety of perspectives among the participants or the patients, in terms of those who are undocumented, how are they going to be feeling? But even those that have their legal papers, what if they say something? Is that going to put them at risk for all that to be revoked? And so I think you have to have, I think, experienced researchers involved in those types of settings, even if there are also going to be new researchers or student researchers involved in some way in the projects. And there needs to be a realization that this is not the same as going to the shopping mall and asking people about their shopping habits. And so that has to, it's going to depend on the exact context of it. But that at the same time, I think there are ways that people with the experience, with the appropriate methodologies, can have some, types of research done that could be appropriate and meaningful for the participants. So it's not, kind of having to maneuver these big issues and do it appropriately to maintain the ethical standards, the research methodology standards, and the respect and dignity of the participants that would be involved.
Thank you. Hannah or Aaron or Terry, would you like to chime in on the potential vulnerabilities of the participants?
Oh, Hannah, you go first.
No, I'm sorry, it's pitch black here now. I was going to honestly say that I'd prefer to hear from others, and I've already taken up some time. I guess I would just say yes, I do think that there are inherent vulnerabilities, particularly, within any conflict affected setting, including displaced populations. But one other thing that bothers me a bit and that I've done some looking into is that there are some fairly well described methods for protecting participants from re-traumatization in qualitative research. Meanwhile, those standards, even if they're informal best practice standards, are essentially absent from some of the more quantitative research methods, including verbal autopsies, which are a way of establishing mortality where health records or other modes of doing that are less easy to come by, such as complex settings. And these can contain very detailed questions about, injury and death, the circumstances of death of a loved one. And I think that, and many of them I've read in that methods section don't have a robust description of what was done to protect participants. And I think it's so easy to kind of word something in a bland way while obfuscating how potentially traumatic that type of questioning can be. So that's all I wanted to add there. And I wish I had more time to hear everyone's thoughts on it.
I think there's a challenge in the academy for junior scholars because they're really being pushed, at least in the social sciences, to produce work that's novel and international. And they're incentivized to stand out among their peers, to conduct original research, to publish a book, publish. That's part of how you stay in the academy. And I think that's where it can become really problematic and extractive. So there's some conflict, I think, that's set up in the academy in terms of being sensitized and sensitive to vulnerable populations. I also think that our methods courses are not adequate for working in conflict zones or with vulnerable populations. I think there's, at least in the social sciences, I'm not seeing a lot of training on how you work in traumatized settings and circumstances. what reflexivity really is. I think I hear a lot of reflection, but that's different than reflexivity, and that understanding of power, and that it actually really matters. So I'm seeing inadequate training or minimal training that could be supportive. And I suppose, and maybe it's a luxury because I'm so much older, and I don't have to worry about some of those things, that at this point, I down to even my research questions, I sit with local people. It's a blended agenda. It doesn't have to be an either or. I think we can produce research that can benefit the academy, but can also benefit the local community. But the way to do that is to involve them from the get-go. From the research questions that are raised, what's important to them, what do they need to find out, and why, and how does that blend with what I'm doing, to the research design, to the kind of the methodologies that are most appropriate. That's part of how I go about doing my research collaborations, and really into the kind of the analysis of what does this data say? It's not just me perched in Ohio reading some data and trying to understand it. I am listening to local voices as they see the same data. And then also agreeing to maybe having more than one or two outputs and outcomes. So the way I try to protect my exploitation and my own extractiveness is to be inclusive of local voices from the very beginning of any project I do. And I think that's helped mitigate some of that tension for me.
Thank you, Terry. And before we go to Aaron, can you just tell us really quickly what the difference is between reflexivity and reflection so that we can sort of make use of that distinction?
Yeah, so for me, reflection is to kind of think back on how could I have done this differently? What worked, what didn't work? What do I wish I would have done differently? And so it's reflective, you're thinking back. Whereas for me, the way I understand reflexivity is in the moment. I'm aware of who I am and what I just said and how it's affecting the person that's sitting across from me or in this focus group. And then how are they affecting me? And then how I'm affecting them and the power differentials. And I'm constantly moderating and modulating those dynamics. I'm sensitive to, I'm acutely aware of it. And I'm making intentional choices. And for me, I make intentional choices around my power. And sometimes I really work at setting it aside. And I do everything I can, and it's impossible, but I try to do everything I can to kind of diminish my power or share my power with the people in the room. And to me, that's reflexivity.
Thank you. Okay, Aaron, thank you for your patience.
Oh, it's no problem. I like hearing what everyone has to say. So for me, a lot of really good research makes me feel like fundamentally uncomfortable. Like it really, I think, repositions in your head like dominant ways you've thought about the world, and it also can make me question or like make me understand privilege generally, and maybe my privilege in a way that I hadn't thought about before. Um, and so I think like, well, first I wanted to say like I struggle with this problem with trying to understand the best way to train students because I bring OSU students with me to the field. And like the problem that arises there is like amplified because I think they see this as like a free vacation. Like it's hard to say like, oh, let's do field work in Cambodia without someone being like, I got a free trip to Asia and where we got to eat cool foods and like do 2 weeks, like spend 2 weeks like being jungle hiking or whatever. And I think it's always really hard to explain to people that like a lot of research is work. It's work and it's hard. Like, yes, an environment can look exotic to you, but that has bad consequences on how you interact with people, I think, if you continue to see it in that foreign mindset. And so like, it's interesting because like the required IRB training that students have, like don't prepare them for any of that. So it's really on like the PI's shoulders to try to understand like what is the best way to use these students, to be honest, both so like the students have a research experience that's helpful, but then also so that your participants, like they're not wasting their time and they're talking to them in like the most respectful, curious way possible. And like one thing that I like think is helpful is like first get like the students like mentally jostled, right? Like get them see how they respond to just being uncomfortable and like recognizing, like having them actually deal with these deeper questions of like, have you like thought about your privilege in your society today and like the ways you are, and like just like it's a weird question, but it's interesting to see how people respond to that, because I think a lot of us just don't think about it regularly, or think about ourselves more in terms of our grievances, rather than like the other types of like structural positionality. And the other thing I found was like deeply helpful was borrowing, I want to say like techniques or frameworks from like literary fiction. So like I remember one thing that I had listened to was an interview with George Saunders and Ann Patchett, and they had talked about how like unique it is, this experience of like reading a novel, because essentially you're committing like 6 to 8 hours or 8 to 10 hours like in the mindset of one other person. And like that's just an experience that you usually never get otherwise, because you're always thinking about things in relation to you and how it will usually improve like you or your social unit. And I thought like that idea was really helpful in trying to understand like interviewing and what you're trying to learn about the other person. Like someone once explained to me that like there's 2 essential forms of listening. The most dominant form of listening that everyone does is that like you're listening to someone either talk to you or answer a question, but you're always thinking about how what they're saying is in like matters in reference to you. So like you're thinking like, oh, I can tell this story to them and they'll think I'm smart, or I can connect with them in this way. But like truly active listening is just like trying to understand what the person is telling you and like see how that tells you more about them. And like then, so the questions that you ask are just like natural follow-up questions where you're like, oh, you told me about this event, like how did that impact you and stuff. And like you're not thinking about it relative to like any social jockeying or like actively trying to create some kind of like deep connection between the two. You're just deeply interested in like who they are and why they're doing these things. And so like trying to understand how you develop that skill and just like knowing the difference between those 2 types of listening is like really helpful, because I think it can take students who, to me, honestly, they're so young, and I think they're still developing both their own selves, but then their relation to themselves. And so like teaching them those other facet of like, now you just need to focus all of your attention on someone else, and like understand what that feels like. Like that's a useful thing to have to, I guess, learn.
Thank you. And so we only have a few minutes left, and I want to give everyone sort of an opportunity to offer any closing remarks or anything that you want to leave on the table. Is that how you say it? You don't want left on the table? I think that's how you say it, right? So, but one of the things I really appreciate what everyone has said so far. I appreciate both the like sort of level of abstraction that we've gotten to at some points, but then the details and the actual like practical guidance has been like incredibly helpful, to think about some of these challenges and how you've found creative ways to mitigate against them. So thank you all for doing that. And I guess my one of the sort of threads that has come up with Hannah's introduction and then throughout the conversation is actually the importance of conducting this kind of research. And like how it's not only like, oh, how do we do it ethically, but like actually it's ethically important for us to not shy away from conducting research in these conflict settings. So if you have any sort of final thoughts that you want to give about, why you think this research is so important, or what drives you to conduct this kind of research, feel free to jump in. So maybe I'll start with Hannah, and then we could go around, and I'll call people.
I mean, I do think I already shared where I'm coming from with this, but I couldn't agree more strongly that it's an ethical imperative to do research in conflict settings. I mean, that's how the Mind-Ban Treaty was passed, right? And now me and my colleagues working in affected settings are trying to do similar things with incendiary weapons, because people have been trying to garner policy movement on this forever, but there are no data to support that. So this is the kind of space that I think is really important in. But Danal, I don't know, maybe you guys can start like a national ethics hotline for me. and not the IRB, different different process, because I think some of these fundamental issues are yeah, I mean they're not going away and not going not addressed by the existing IRB processes. Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe Donald, do you want to go next?
Well, yeah, definitely that idea of some sort of hotline or call a research ethicist is something I've been working on for years, and it just hasn't gotten to the point of it being sustainable. I guess as I was thinking about whether there's anything we haven't brought up, I've been thinking about the safety of researchers themselves, that I think this is an additional component that's really crucial with this type of research. And by that, I include psychological as well as physical. There's clear physical issues if you're going into an active conflict zone. But the psychological impact on researchers needs to be taken into account, and then provision taken for that. And I think that ties in with the young researcher type of training as well, that it may seem, cutting edge and dramatic to go into some of these settings and do some of these interviews. But everybody needs to think about the impact on the researchers, especially new ones, and then on having at the very least debriefing or just mechanisms, practical mechanisms to help them afterwards.
Erin, do you want to go next? And Terry, you could have the last word.
Oh, sure. I conduct my research because I kind of firmly believe that if I don't do it, then I don't think anyone else will. Not at least like with this focus in like this deep area knowledge of Cambodia, with the array of, I think, methods that I'm able to apply to these questions. And I think that's just a really important motivation for me to have, because I mean, to be honest, I don't know the number of academics who are in this audience, but like it's very hard for me to keep academic motivation otherwise. Like I don't really care about article placement. I feel like my chair should not be on this call. But publications I care less about in terms of where they hit, and like citation numbers I think are kind of silly. But it's very important for me to have like an internal motivation. And I think it's the fact that like through creating this body of knowledge, like it's very nice to be part of this like small community that feels very deeply about these issues. And so like the unexploded ordnance community is like crazy small. I mean, it's very cool that Hannah and I get to like meet each other through this call and this panel. But it's like it's deeply connected to each other and to the issue at hand. And it's even though like the problems that I'm like finding about unexploded ordnance and their legacy effects are overwhelming, I think, to try to find these like very neat pat answers to, I think the one thing that sustains me is the fact that like there is like this group of people who are very impassioned to help, and it just kind of defies like all like logical, rational homo economists like leanings that I would otherwise think about. And like it's really cool to think about like step by step, like the international institutions and treaties that have been like created, as well as some of the domestic hands-tying policies that have been like induced because of these international norms against explosive ordnance, unexploded ordnance, and landmines. So like it's really nice to have that be the thing that motivates you to do your research, rather than like just the pure need to get tenure, or to have like some external evaluator think your research is methodologically sound.
Terry, do you want to share final thoughts?
Sure. I think, Erin, I would probably be one of your students way back when that thought going to Cambodia was kind of sexy, and I wouldn't have admitted it. I would have been, I'm full of conviction. I really believe in this. I want to stop the suffering of the world. But probably early on, I was in situations with mixed motives. But as you said, once you're inside those situations, it's a whole nother reality. And it's very hard work, and it's troubling, and it's awkward, and it's painful, and you make a ton of mistakes. But hopefully, as you grow into becoming a more mature researcher, you're more aware of that in you and how to mitigate those things. And at least for me, and my motivation working in the field of peace and conflict is that people are really suffering. And that really does bother me. And that is a deep conviction. And I don't think conflict and violence and suffering is going to go away. So I think the work is incredibly important. And there's a certain kind of knowledge, at least for me, that no other method other than field research can replace. The full immersion really helps us understand the nuances, the bald reality of what people are facing, the desperation. And it helps me have a better appreciation for the reality of people's lives. And so, Dana, I agree. It's for me, the privilege and the power that I have becomes a right and a responsibility to engage in this work. But I would leave and also say, and there have been times that I shouldn't have been where I was. And so I think we need to be honest about really asking the question, is my presence in this location necessary or helpful, or whatever the word, helpful is not the right word, but can it produce some good, at least some good? Can my presence do some good? And if the answer is no, then I think we need to back up and say, then maybe I shouldn't be doing this particular project. I think we need to ask those hard questions.
Well, thank you, Terry, Erin, Donal, and Hannah for sharing the past hour and 20 minutes, your thoughts and your practices and your questions. I have learned a lot from this conversation, and thank you all in the audience for asking such amazing questions as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Stay safe.